Many of us get a chance to allocate our labor hours across different days of the week or different weeks of the year. In some cases, some days are high-wage days, on an average, while others are low-wage days. Will people work more on high-wage days and less on low-wage days? Which is the prediction of labor economics, and that was the question that Colin Kammerer and his colleagues were looking to answer in a paper that was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 1997. In fact, this paper was looking to address a number of interesting questions. Why is it difficult to get a taxi in New York City on days in which it rains or in which there's a convention in town? Well, you would expect that the general demand for taxis is high and therefore the average wage rate for a taxi driver is also high. You would expect that taxi drivers would choose to work longer hours on days in which the going is good. The goal of this paper was to test whether in fact the labor hours and wages are positively correlated as the life cycle model of labor supply predicts. In other words, do workers work more when wages are high? This was a field study, and the authors used data that was typically collected as part of routine operations, in other words, archived data. And the data that were used here were 3 data sets provided by a fleet company and the New York Taxi and Limo Commission, hereafter called the NYTLC. The data came in the form of a trip sheet, a sequential list of trips that a driver took on a given day. Next time you sit in a taxi, you might notice that the driver actually has a clipboard where he or she writes down where you left, where you ended up, how much you paid. That is a trip sheet. There were 3 types of cab drivers in the dataset. There were daily fleet drivers who leased their cabs from a fleet company for a 24-hour window. There were lease drivers who leased the cabs weekly or monthly. And finally, there were owner drivers who owned their own medallion-bearing taxi and drive it. 3 data sets were collected by the authors. The first data set was provided by a fleet company and had 70 trip sheets from daily fleet drivers. The second data set and the third both were collected from the NYTLC. The second one had 1,044 trip sheets, daily fleet drivers, lease drivers, and owner drivers. Whereas the third one had 712 trip sheets just from lease drivers and owner drivers. And the labor hours and daily income of cab drivers were collected from these trip sheets. The method of analysis that was used was regression, and while the regression results pointed out to a number of interesting facts, there were 3 key ideas that jumped up, 3 key pieces of conclusions that jumped up, and that had to do with the correlation between the wages and the hours worked, both on a log scale, for each of the 3 data sets. All of these numbers were significant and negative. And the negative suggests that when the wage rates were high on an average, when the going was good, cab drivers actually drove less. Now, this was interesting for a number of different perspectives, but that was the simple approach that the authors took to analyzing the data. In conclusion, wages were correlated within days, but they seemed to be uncorrelated between days, and the wage elasticities were negative. But more importantly, these results here suggested that cab drivers make labor decisions on a daily basis instead of allocating labor and leisure across multiple days. And in particular, it seemed like they would set a daily income quota or a target and stop working on that day when they reached the target. If the wage rate was high and the going was good, they would reach the target sooner, and as a result, they would stop working sooner. And that is why it is difficult to get a taxi in New York or Singapore or even Hong Kong on a rainy day, because the average wage rate is high and taxi drivers quit sooner.